a large proportion.
It's a great
Well, I
source of
teach
inspiration, isn't
history.
it? Even better.
Okay, so welcome to World Building. No, sorry, that's the panel that I did yesterday. Welcome to Grimdark Fantasy and Horror panel. I'm David Green. I obviously do not know what day it is or where I am, but I'm here moderating this panel with my lovely guests. And we'll go around and introduce everyone in a second. So I'm David Green. I'm the author of the Nick Halloran series, which is a dark urban fantasy noir, which has got lots of kind of hard-boiled detective elements in it. And I also have a dark fantasy series called Empire of Ruin, which is a grimdark series, which is coming out in June. So going around the table, with me is Phil Williams. Why don't you tell everyone about yourself?
Right, yeah. So I'm Phil Williams, as you said. I write mostly urban fantasy thrillers, and they have a kind of leaning towards horror. And I don't know, I guess it's part of the discussion, what's the line between dark fantasy and horror. But yeah, I tend to go down a kind of thriller route when I'm aiming for my genre style, and I've got kind of horror elements in there in terms of how the fantasy comes through. So as I said, it's the Ordshaw series. It starts with Under Ordshaw, and I'm up to, I think, about 5 books in that series now. And the latest one I've done has gone a little bit of a pivot to even darker kind of story that goes into the wilderness. And I call that one a supernatural thriller because it's a little bit more of a horror than an urban fantasy.
Okay, sounds cool. Alan, thank you for coming on. Why don't you tell everyone about yourself?
Yes, well, my name's Alan Batchelder, and I wrote the complete works of William Shakespeare. But after that, I wrote a 5-novel series called Immortal Treachery, and it's a massive grim opus, I suppose. But it does have a good deal of horror in it, specifically body horror at different points, which I think is normal for a person sliding into middle age. you experience a lot of personal body horror as you get older, but I will pass it along to the next guest.
Thanks very much. And as someone who is rapidly approaching 40, I completely agree with you about the body horror aspect of that. It's not nice. Also is Carol A. Park.
I am Carol A. Park. I guess he said that. I am the author of the Heretic Gods books trilogy. Final one not out yet. It is dark fantasy, I'm told, because I didn't realize that when I wrote it, so I kind of accidentally fell into it. That might be interesting too when we talk about the difference between dark fantasy and not and that sort of thing. One of the books is a standalone called Sweet Blade, which I guess strays into Grimdark, which I'm also told. So I also have started another series which is not dark fantasy, so we won't talk about that one today.
Well, you may bring it up at some point. It's okay. We can talk about other things too. It's fine. And last but definitely not least is Anna Smith-Spark.
Hi, I'm Anna Smith-Spark. I'm the author of the Empires of Dust series, not to be confused with the Empires of Ruin series, obviously. Many other Empire series. I love every single book ever with the Empire of something in the title. But yeah, the Empires of Dust series, the Court of Broken Knives, the Tower of Living Dying, and the House of Sacrifice, as well as various short stories, including one in this book, Lost Gods, I'm desperately trying to promote because it's come out in lockdown, so no one's been able to publish it or indeed buy a copy of it. The books are definitely described as grimdark. Indeed, I tweet as Queen of Grimdark because my first book was blurbed as that by Michael R. Fletcher, the God of Grimdark. So, and yes, I have actually apologised to Joe Abercrombie personally for the number of people who make jokes on Twitter about whether I'm married to him, which I'm not.
Yeah, that is confusing at times, but that's just the way it is. And plus, if the God of Grimdark has said that you are the Queen of Grimdark, then who is to argue with the God of Grimdark? And I think Joe Abercrombie was self-proclaimed as well, so that's the way it is. So thanks for everyone who's joined in with us at the moment. We have a few topics to talk about, but if you have any questions or any comments that you would like to make, the chat is open, and we will get to any of your questions that we don't cover ourselves when we're going through the topics. So the first thing that I want to ask for the panel, I might start with Carol, seeing as you kind of mentioned it yourself, is the difference between dark fantasy and grimdark, because there is a difference between it, and obviously it's nuanced. It's not, you can't just kind of look at something and just say, yes, this is this and this is this, and there might be things that kind of bleed over a little bit. But from your point of view, what do you think is the difference between dark fantasy and grimdark?
I think it's dark fantasy as a term in and of itself, I think is interesting because it's kind of vague. Like, what does it mean for something to be dark? It can be atmospherically dark. It can be psychologically dark. It can be gritty. It could be horror, which is dark in its way. And so, like, it's a very broad term, which is why I kind of accidentally wrote it, I guess, because I wasn't really setting out to write dark fantasy, but the world is atmospherically dark. There are dark things like demons that come through portals, rifts, and eat people. So I guess it's kind of dark. But I think the difference why I would not call generally that series, for instance, Grimdark, is, I guess, I don't really know. There's a sense of hope in it where the characters are at heart good, but the world around them is very dark. And so it for me, it has a lot to do with characters, and I don't know. So the one book that people have said, well, it's kind of strays into grimdark, but I'm not really sure, is a fall from grace story about one of the main characters who starts good and ends up kind of bad. So I guess maybe that's why, and it's also very psychologically, there's a lot of body harm and depression and topics like that covered in it. So I guess that's why it starts to get more grim than just dark. So that's from my experience. I don't actually read a ton of grimdark myself, which is why I'm like, I don't write grimdark. What are you talking about? So, but that's kind of where I'm going from. I'd love to hear what other people have to say, though.
It's funny how you say that about how you write things. So the first novel I ever wrote, which was actually like picked up by a publisher, is a crime thriller set in the 1940s America, and I do not read that genre whatsoever. I still don't know why I wrote it, but I did. It was a story just living in my head, and I was like, well, let's just do it, and then let's see what happens. And it's just one of those things. Alan, what's your point of view on the difference between dark fantasy and grimdark?
Well, I read a lot of grimdark. I haven't gotten to Anna's books yet, but they pop up all the time at the top of my lists in all the groups I'm in. So I think Mark Lawrence would say it's a morally ambiguous universe where there are lots of shades of gray, but there isn't necessarily a clear black or a white. Mm-hmm. For me, in grimdark, there's always a subtle political element to it. Not overt, as I said, but this idea that the power for real change, for equity, for the common man rests beyond the common man's reach, and it's usually in the hands of a cadre of corrupt magicians or bankers or politicians or some king or other. And I really, really love that aspect of it, and I don't see that as often in dark fantasy. And I mean, forgive me, I know we've already talked about him quite a bit, but Abercrombie's current series does a great job of illustrating that. Where everyone is a pawn. Well, everyone is always a pawn for Baez in his books, but everyone is some sort of a pawn struggling to eke out an existence. And there isn't a great deal of hope, actually. There are those few moments that just shine like gems every once in a while that redeem the whole effort. Dark fantasy to me is more along the lines of what Carol said. It's a darker universe, but it doesn't preclude the possibility of great light at some point that can save the day. I don't see in Grimdark, I don't see a great light coming along and saving the day, a great force for good necessarily. Whew. All right, someone else's turn.
And obviously, spoilers for Joe Abercrombie's books, probably from going forwards as well, because we're probably going to be talking about them a lot because they're very popular. Lots of people have read them. It's interesting that you mentioned Mark Lawrence there as well, because obviously, and I pronounce it as Jorg because I'm European. I don't know if people say Jorg or what.
George, it's a joke. Oh, it's just George.
Well,
Joke
I've never spoke to Mark Lawrence, so you've probably spoke to him and asked him. But I just
I've never actually asked him, but I'm pretty certain. There's a bit where they talk about he calls himself Little Georgie or something. There's a little
yeah. See, in my head, I was calling him Little Yorgie, which is just like I need to just go and reread it as George. But it's funny because his character would be an amazing villain in a dark fantasy book, I would think. But obviously, in his series, is the protagonist in a way. And like Anna, with your books, I find your books to have like very, very deep characterization. Which is great. And would you say that's an aspect of grimdark versus dark fantasy, where it's like you get that time to kind of drill deeper into the psychology of the characters?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important part of Grimdark is that actually, so we were talking just before, actually people may have heard, possibly at the very end of our conversations before we went live, about how we all studied history, and in fact Alan teaches history. And for me, while I love kind of high epic heroic fantasy, as I said, there is not a book with something about the chosen heir to an empire who will restore the empire, and his name's got a couple of entirely gratuitous apostrophes in it, which French just had me on the floor. Like, yeah, this is it. But what Grimdark does for me is it is very much like military history, which is something else I love. It is about real people in real situations in which there's no hero. There's no, this is the right thing to do. This is the noble cause. It's not. History is very, very rarely. Occasionally, the Second World War, occasionally you have moments where you are Aragorn, that one side is Aragorn, the other side is Sauron. Usually it's really not like that. Usually history is different groups of people with very different personalities, probably with similar motivations, as in all the money, all the power, all the girls, fighting it out. And it's the complex, the sense of who you identify with, who you're interested in, which side you feel you're on, is very much driven by how you respond to the different people involved, the different characters involved, and how you're kind of, everyone has different sort of takes and perspectives on figures in history, what they're trying to achieve, what they're doing, what they think about them. And that for me is what is at the heart of Grimdark. A lot of Grimdark is very military. My own stuff is extreme, ends up in sort of total war. Steve Erickson, who I know does not consider himself Grimdark, but is almost always described as Grimdark, he is writing war. R. Scott Baker, who is to me the greatest living writer of Grimdark, is writing total war, and it is in that that historical setting of just looking at the clash of empires or conquest and the messiness of it, the fact there's no good, there's no right or wrong, there's no one side being better than the other. There is just people, there are just different people, different sort of characters you look at. So yeah, I look at some of the Marith is about the great man in history. As a classicist, I've read an awful lot about the great man theory of history. He is the great man, the figure it's trying to unpack what earth it must have been like to be to be Alexander, to be Caesar, to be someone who has such a vast amount of power and destructive power at your personal control, essentially, at your whim. And then there's a lot of stuff about ordinary soldiers, about ordinary people, about women caught up in the aftermath of war, about ordinary soldiers in war. And it's about not about that they have this great quest, they have this great destiny, they have this great purpose, as in traditional tradition, I pick fantasy. It's about how are they dealing with this hyped, taken up to 11 real situation they're in, of war, of conflict, of the collision of different wants and needs and desires. So yeah, for me, Grimdark is very much about individual people in a kind of taken up to 11 realistic world.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and it's so about the kind of ordinary person caught up in a conflict. A conflict is such a great point, and something that it's funny when Erickson doesn't say that he's a Grimdark writer, because a lot of his, especially at the start of the series, a lot of his, I mean, Deadhouse Gates is just a bunch of ordinary people caught up in a horrifying, terrible situation and how they deal with it, and it's probably one of the darkest books I've ever read in my life. Actually, it's just the ending. I remember reading that ending the first time, and it's a real punch in the gut when you get there. Phil, we'll go to you. What are your thoughts on the?
Well, I think they've been said very eloquently already. I'd go a bit deeper into character where Carol started from. I agree with everything everyone's said so far. But for me, I guess the difference would be the way that we look at the characters over the course of this story. The way we manifest the story always comes down to what are we talking about where the character starts, where do they finish? And I think that's kind of what manifests the nature of dark fantasy. As I said, can be a heroic journey. Grimdark can just be a bleak journey. It depends what we want to expose in the characters. And I guess well, from where I'm coming from, I suppose it's not necessarily about where the setting is, what's happening. I think the military is important because that's often just where we find these stories. That's where it's most interesting. But I guess we could still choose the leader. And if we want to show him as a bad person who gets worse or doesn't learn anything, then to me, that would be going down the Grimdark route, where if we want to show him as someone who maybe has remorse and redemption, then we're going down the dark fantasy route. So I'd see it somewhere around then. It brings to me, it brings my two books that I think, I guess, polarize the two quite well. One of the earliest Grimdarks that I read would have been Black Company. And I think that does a great job of you're just in a place where you don't know exactly why they're doing all this. They're just basically completely amoral characters you're not sure if they're fighting on the side of good or bad. Well, they're pretty clearly not fighting on the side of good, but they're not necessarily fighting for evil. They're just kind of caught up in it all. And on the dark fantasy side, I read recently Mike Shell's the first one in his Iconoclast series. Sorry. And I found that quite refreshing because I've read quite a lot of Grimdark recently, a lot of these very miserable stories about miserable people. And it was quite refreshing to read a story that it's a very dark story, but it's got very good characters in it. And you're just left thinking, oh, this is actually, there's some nice people in a dark fantasy story. And it was just a bit different for me at the time. Anyway, yeah, I think he does that very well. And I think that's a very good example of what dark fantasy looks like.
What's interesting is I thought, so if you think about timescale, so dark fantasy is a term that's been around for quite a long time, was Grimdark a new term. And I kind of think Grimdark emerges as a literary concept in fantasy very quite recently, essentially in the kind of late 90s, early 21st century, when the Cold War is over. You have Francis Fukuyama writing his famous "Totally Wrong: The End of History," which I think this year is clear proof that he was totally wrong. But you have that people have that concept that essentially liberal democracy, for all its faults, has won over communism. We haven't ended up the Cold War. The Cold War has not got hot. We have survived. I mean, I look back now, it's weird. I remember apparently my mum nearly took us all to New Zealand in 1980 because she was so convinced that we were all going to be annihilated in nuclear war. Apartheid South Africa has collapsed. There is a general sense in Western Europe and in North America, certainly, that things are probably going to get a bit better. People aren't scared they're going to be blown up. They're scared of nuclear war. We've got this point just before kind of Islamist terrorism. There's a general kind of sense of people are saying publicly things like racism is bad guys, homophobia is bad guys. It clearly exists. It never feels acceptable for someone to be on television making a comment which is overtly racist or overtly homophobic or overtly sexist. Women are getting into the workplace more. And there's a sense the world's kind of okay. The world might get better. And that's the point at which I think people are really feeling able to, okay, what I'm going to write is I'm going to take fantasy, but rather than talking about making the kind of classic, the chosen one who's going to make the world better, you're just going to play around with the idea of absolute immorality and kind of, all political leaders are absolutely corrupt. Everyone's just in it. Even the people who say that they're fighting for the good are actually just in it for the drink and the tits. That kind of, because there's a safe feeling at that point in Western culture. Talk about that, to undermine everything, to kind of to really just sort of take your heroes and really just smash them to pieces. maybe we're moving away from that again now, and I think that's the difference, is that level of cynicism and playing around and being very cynical about power and about people's motivations. At that time, it felt quite safe to do that. I suspect there's a less interest in it now. I suspect people are drawing away from that bit now. They want slightly more redemptive, hopeful stories again.
Because that's a good point. Because that's one of the reasons why people think the Lord of the Rings films were so popular, was because they came out immediately after 9/11, and it gave people this sense of hope. There's a hopeful story that people could kind of band together with. But on the other side of the coin as well, the rise of very kind of anti-hero cinema in the mid-70s, like Scorsese and De Palma and all these kind of people, were very, very dark stories, which were, because the 70s in general were quite a safe period for people. There was like the end of the 70s, and that's why the people's art then turns to darker areas to explore these things that aren't happening in real life so much anymore.
It's interesting to see the kind of parallel in the war films as well. I guess that kind of era in the 80s, late 80s, you start to get all these very kind of negative Vietnam War films. And then later we have the Iraq War films, and they tend to be very sort of nihilistic and, again, are quite amoral in places there.
Yeah.
Well, I think that in the United States anyway, it started really in the Civil War, when you started having photographers on the battlefield, and no longer were the citizens relying on somebody's relating of a battle. They could actually see the impact and effects. And then, of course, dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki leaves an entire country feeling somewhat ambivalent. On one hand, you win the war, but on the other hand, what is the cost? And then we follow up with the Vietnam War, where we're burning villages to the ground in order to save them. And we do develop a lot of cynicism about war. It's not this wonderful patriotic good guys versus the bad guys thing that we maybe grown up believing or reading about as children. And that's what I love about Erickson. And then he, of course, attributes it to Glenn Cook, but this really bringing kind of the Vietnam War era into your writing, into the troops, into the life in the trenches. And it's just very, very gritty and brutal. And there is nothing particularly noble about it. It's just a bunch of grunts trying to survive until the next meal,
Yeah.
I hope I said something coherent in all of that.
No, you definitely did. So we'll move on to the next topic. So Carol, we'll go back to you. So it's just basically what I want to kind of talk about is, obviously with Grimdark we do explore the darker areas of fantasy and what happens to people in particular. Like in some of these books, very unpleasant things happens to people on a regular basis. And Alan has mentioned before about the body horror aspects of it. So what I kind of want to talk about is where is the line between horror and fantasy when we go into dark fantasy and grimdark? Where is the line where it becomes a horror story with elements with a fantasy setting, or where's the line where it's still grimdark but it has horror elements? Would you like to have your thoughts on that?
Sure, I can put thoughts out. I don't know if I have an answer necessarily. I mean, is there ever a line? I don't know. Usually it's a gradient, or when do you go either way? I mean, I think when I think of horror, there's horror in the sense of like Dracula, and there's horror in the sense of slasher flicks. There's different kinds of ways you can go with that. There's body horror, there's, you know, psychological thrillers, which sometimes can kind of slide into horror in ways. There's the, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously, if you're setting something in a contemporary setting, it's not fantasy necessarily. I think you're more horror in the sense of, if it's a secondary world, sometimes I feel like that's feels more fantasy than something set in, you know, today. And there's, you know, I don't know, you know, a serial killer about, and maybe there's a little bit of a magical element or something. Is that more horror than a secondary world? Can you have like a horror first fantasy secondary world I don't know. Like I'll be honest, I don't particularly like horror films or slasher flicks. Yet one of my books features a serial killer. I don't know where I came up with this stuff. So, you know, I think sometimes the characterization, going back to that a little bit, is really what kind of makes these things slide certain ways. Because when you're in a point of view of a person's mind, what are they thinking? Where are they at? What's happening? Are you delving into the darkness? Are they finding hope? And I don't know where horror and dark fantasy and grimdark, kind of where those lines are. So maybe somebody who watches more horror, reads more horror, would have a better answer for that particular thing. So
I remember reading one point. I'm a big fantasy fan in general, and obviously, I think a lot of us kind of start with Lord of the Rings and kind of progress from there in a lot of aspects. But like Wheel of Time would be the thing that I read the most growing up, and it was something that I noticed. And I don't know if anyone else has read that series, but the first book in particular had lots of horror elements in it, like dreams and visions and people where like the faces were becoming flames and all this kind of stuff, and it kind of just went away then in the later books. But it's definitely something that people, I know that I do it, and with Jim Butcher with the Dresden books as well, especially the early ones, have a lot of that kind of horror element in them too. So Phil, I know you kind of stray into that area as well, don't you?
Yeah, I guess it depends. As far as I'm concerned, I suppose it just depends a bit where your emphasis lies, like which elements of the story are you emphasizing, which are you dwelling on. And I think, as Carol says, the characterization is important there, because it depends if you've got a character who is honed towards being absolutely horrified by what you present, then you're going to lean more towards horror. If it's someone who copes with it in a different way, then you can steer it a bit away from exactly how horrible it is. It's a tricky one though, I think, and I've found probably that I consider my books to contain more horror the more feedback I get from readers who consider them to be horrible. Like, because every now and again I'll get people who say, like, I couldn't sleep after reading that, and I was like, really? Oh, okay. And you know, it's stuff that I might not necessarily think is quite as scary. And then there might be elements that I put in deliberately that aren't as scary as I think. So I don't know. But so I think sometimes the reader perception comes in there as well. But I'd say the starting point is what kind of reaction you're aiming to elicit, I think, because I think when we're trying to do something in the area of horror, we're really trying to unsettle people. And I think that the other thing that comes into that is the scope of the story. As we've said a few times, that with the Grimdark, we often look at political and the military, and it's more difficult to do something really horrible with that. I mean, there definitely are some really horrible things in Grimdark like that. But when you look at horror, a lot of horror is often much more narrowly focused, and we're looking at sort of how a character really descends into the worst. Whereas with Grimdark, when we pull the scope back a bit, we just, again, change the emphasis, I think. I think to me that's one way of looking at it anyway.
Perfect.
I
I was going to come to you anyway. That's great.
That kind of the uncanny. So I was doing a thing a while ago, actually, you talk, and there was me and a crime writer, and he suddenly started talking about Beowulf as a horror story. And of course, if you think about it in its original context, being told to people who, while they are, essentially it is a story that is being told to people who are Anglo-Saxon Christians about their forebearers who are pagans, and this kind of weird pagan, very kind of eldritch landscape, and this kind of, you know, the sense, that terrifying sense of what's out there in the dark in a community which is presumably feeling fairly threatened anyway, given it's kind of, we've got sort of Viking, sort of Anglo-Saxon Britain is kind of, it's a violent society. We have Viking incursions, and you have this sort of story about people a couple of generations previously who were pagan, who were therefore themselves strange and eldritch and suspect. But the things coming in from the marshlands, Beowulf, so you have Grendel's mother, then you have the dragon, and they are these kind of, it's actually a kind of classic horror. If you think about it, it's actually a classic horror story.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a lot of elements in things like that in the Lord of the Rings, the kind of the ring wraiths. Mm-hmm. They are figures straight out of kind of English fears of things in barrows and things. Again, they're actually the same fear of the old, the old pagan kings out there are dead in their barrows. Mm-hmm. And that's clearly what a lot of stuff about things like the ring wraiths are. My dad read me the Lord of the Rings when I was 10, and I found them absolutely terrifying as these kind of horrifying monstrous beings. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of elements of that in fantasy. It can become quite muted in some fantasy, but I think what I'm trying to do with kind of my weird, inexplicable, so I have some kind of weird numinous things in my books that kind of come in, and there's never really an explanation for it. And it is trying to get that sense of a kind of numinous, terrifying world, a world in which people are very powerless. I've been lost out on the salt marshes inland from Dunwich, which is actually seriously is a drowned. There is actually a drowned city. It was one of the great Anglo-Saxon ports of Britain, medieval ports, and it was drowned, taken by the sea, and it is actually called Dunwich. And I've been lost on the salt marshes around there after dark, and it is absolutely terrifying. Yeah, that kind of numinous sense of a very frightening pagan landscape that's just absolutely saturated by horror and fear of the dark and of the unknown and of gods and monsters that are out there. And that, I think, is a really kind of powerful it is a very, very powerful thing to bring into one's writing in horror, that kind of sense of the world as being destabilizing and frightening and uncontrollable, and just beyond mortal ken.
Mm-hmm. Well, we want to challenge not only the reader but the characters that are in the book, and there's nothing more better to challenge a character than to confront them with their own fears, the deepest fears as well. So it's obviously when you're talking dark fantasy and grimdark, we want to challenge our characters as much as we possibly can. Mm. So Alan, what you obviously you were talking about body horror earlier, so go to town.
Well, I love horror. I try to alternate grimdark with horror, and I almost exclusively watch horror movies, and Halloween's my favorite holiday. So it's a big deal to me, and it's interesting that Anna mentioned Beowulf, because I'm writing about Grendel right now. If you can imagine him running loose in the Jamestown colony, circa 1619. But I think part of it is it is more personal than grimdark. It's an individual thing. We are alone. That's what horror does. You're alone. You're facing death alone. You can be holding your loved one's hand while you're on your deathbed, but ultimately they're not going with you. You're alone. And that's what the darkness does. That's what the body horror does. That's what the claustrophobia does. That's all of those things isolate us and make us feel doomed in a way. Doomed to suffer. And I think of the end of movies like Blair Witch Project, where she comes around the corner in the darkness and there's her friend turned to the corner, standing in the corner facing the wall. And you just have this horrible feeling he's absolutely and utterly all alone. Or there's another great movie called The Lie. And at the end of that, I just felt hollow. I felt those poor children are utterly doomed. And it's beyond the hopelessness in some cases of grimdark. It's a certainty of doom. And I think that's one of the things that just raises the hairs on the back of your neck. And while there may not be happy endings in Grimdark, for me, there are none in true horror. You know, every time I see or read a book where it has a happy ending in horror, it's dissatisfying for me, because the job of horror is to transport you into that unknowable, desolate, despairing place. And if there's a happy ending to it, I feel like there's a bit of a failure there. I mean, it is the undiscovered country, really. We're talking about death in some ways, suffering and death. And you'd like to preview that, to go there without actually going there, I guess.
Well,
Oh.
Go on, Carol. Go ahead.
I thought what you were saying about delving into like the beyond hopelessness, the kind of that place. Like I said, I don't actually read or watch a lot of horror. I think the closest I come is Stranger Things, which I have a love-hate relationship with. I love it, but it's also terrifies me, especially the first season. And I think that actually goes back to a little bit of the Grimdark, and we're talking about the individual versus pulling back to military, and that just brings me in mind of whenever you're really delving deep into a character who has reached the end of everything, and whether that means literal death, psychological death, that is in a way there's an element of horror to that, and I don't know, is that grimdark or horror? And I think that's interesting, like when you reach that end. And I think then when you say it's not grimdark is whenever as an author you're not staying there but still exploring it, right? Going there, but then like you said, if it has a happy ending, was it really horror? I don't know what it was, right? So I thought that was interesting, that just the distinctions between the military, the individual, the depths, and then do you stay there or do you come out of it? I just some thoughts rolling around in my head that I don't know if that was coherent, but
it's all coherent. This is a lovely conversation for Sunday, the holiest of days. We're talking about death and all this kind of fun stuff. It's great. This is what writing is all about. Phil, you had some thoughts that you wanted to.
What was I going to say? Yeah, I think Carol said it quite well. I was going to agree with Alan. I think you made some really good points there. I think that idea of the way the story ends, I think, is really kind of crucial in the way we define it sometimes, because that it speaks to where we've been going in our journey. And I think that that's true with a lot of horror. I find if you have a horror with a happy ending, or at least horror, I think it doesn't have to be completely horrible. I don't think we necessarily need to finish in the worst possible state. But I find even if horror sort of takes a step back and you find that the characters have been maybe rewarded a bit more than I wanted, like I don't want to, I've got an example in mind, but I'm not going to say because it'll be a complete spoiler. But for instance, where you've had horror building through the whole story and then suddenly there's a twist ending and it's almost like, oh, and then they were okay. It's a bit like it was all a dream, kind of that attitude. It's like, that's not what we want, really. We want to see that at the best, it got worse and worse and we somehow survived. But maybe not, it was happy. It shouldn't be.
Like the Donner Party, you know, the famous or the infamous Donner Party. Yes, some of them survived, but the cost and the memories linger for the rest of their lives. So it's not a happy ending, but it's completely irredeemably bleak.
I mean, the classic ghost story. I mean, I've read M.R. James's stories are just, I mean, that's kind of ghost stories, horror. They are just still unsurpassable, and they like the Blair Witch Project. They are found, you know, they're presented as found footage essentially. They are documents, and the resolution is essentially that the protagonist is claimed by the dark forces. They're very, very rare. James works through his kind of, you know, we're talking about people reading diaries, people reading old documents. It's very, very rare that the actual person who's experiencing the horror survives it. You're hearing someone else's story, like the Blair Witch Project, which just ends with, we cannot tell you what happened to them, but it was not good. And that, yeah, you don't want, as soon as you're given some kind of resolution, it kind of loses some of its power, because it is that sense of inevitability, that crushing, horrifying sense of this is just inevitable and inescapable, that the horror that you cannot escape. But yeah, it is that sort of obviously.
There are two examples of that come to mind. One is the more recent movie, The Witch, where spoiler alert, the protagonist does go over to the dark side at the very end of the movie. And then the other one was a 1978 remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where we discovered Donald Sutherland, the protagonist, has been body snatched. We think everything's okay. We see him, we're relieved, and then we discover right before the screen goes dark that he's been replaced.
Yeah.
And I love those endings.
Mm-hmm. It's like The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, which is obviously loosely based on Body Snatchers as well. Anyway, and it's a great. I mean, it's horror, but it's also a great ending for Grimdark as well, because you're just left with two people freezing to death, and neither of them trust each other. Neither of them know which one is the alien. Spoilers for a 40-year-old film, and it's a brilliant ending because obviously you don't know who it is. I mean, you can kind of guess, but for them, it's a perfect ending for that because there's no resolution. What happens afterwards? Obviously, one of them is going to die, and one of them is going to be there, but you don't know. It's a fantastic kind of ending. We've got an interesting discussion here in the comments between sorry if I get your name wrong, Elia Kipnis and Fiddles T Brigand, which is a fantastic name for
Fiddles T Brigand again. Hi.
I just think of it. I know you're not a cat because I know cats can't write. Fiddles T Brigand is the greatest cat name I've ever heard in my life. So we've talked about before about the difference between grimdark and dark fantasy, and Elia says, is it about power and agency that the protagonists have? And Fiddles goes on to say about the Dresden example that there is still horror in the later books, but in the earlier books it seems more prevalent because Dresden has less power than he does as the series progresses. So that's quite an interesting one. And we'll probably talk about this and then we'll talk about the quote that I have for you. We might as well finish with the quote in a second. But character agency, does that have something that comes? Is there less character agency in terms of fantastical things that they can do to get out of situations in Grimdark than there is in dark fantasy? And we'll start with Anna with that one.
Yeah, I think that is. It is that I've used about the trap a lot. So what I actually see a lot of my work is doing is talking a lot about the trap of male violence, of kind of toxic masculinity, that this is as in real life, these are people who are absolutely trapped in a situation. They don't have a lot of power and agency. I mean, I may try and talk even the kind of very characters in my books who seem very powerful. I sometimes describe my books as grimdark epic fantasy because they certainly have very powerful kind of epic characters in them, but everyone is trapped within their own little confines. They are kind of oppressed by the world. They are trapped in military forces. It's kind of, so I'm talking about, so when I'm sort of writing about war and things, that kind of sense of it being inescapable, that kind of even someone who is right at the top of the military hierarchy with a huge amount of power and supposedly a huge amount of power and autonomy, that they are trapped within this military system. They are trapped within their own power. They're trapped within the way that their world works. And yeah, no one in my books actually particularly has agency and power. I mean, it's interesting to think about something like George Ancraft. He again almost has this kind of sense of being trapped. It's this kind of, he seems to be a very kind of free character. I know Mark has talked about how he was looking to write a kind of Ayn Rand in a fantasy setting. Supposedly George Ancraft is this kind of absolute total individual who just has this absolute sense of his own absolute power. But in fact, I was very trapped. I was feeling intensely sorry for him. That kind of sense of dark fantasy, you have figures who are not trapped in the same way. They're not kind of caught. I mean, most of George R. Martin's characters are very trapped as well. They can't get out of that society. It is an awareness that the individual is is trapped within that society. A bit about horror in war, because there's a lot of, what really interests me a lot is that kind of overlap, the kind of the weird stuff in war, that kind of slightly uncanny. A lot of people who've been in war will talk about, that kind of belief that the soldier who cannot die, or the kind of, the soldier who foretells his own death, or that kind of, all that kind of weird arcane stuff that comes around war. And I think again, there's that sense of powerlessness, that that is a situation, the consummate situation in which people are just absolutely trapped and powerless. And there's a lot of sense of kind of oppression coming in from outside them. You feel very physical. There's a sense of physical and mental oppression, which is what a lot of the horror is from. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this is that kind of economy.
Phil, we'll come to you with that one.
I think that Anna's done a great job of summarising that. I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's an interesting one, because I guess you can expand from that and kind of look at what's happening with the characters in the other kind of genres. We can start to look at how the difference works there, because I think that's absolutely true. In Grimdark, you have these characters who are basically kind of overwhelmed by the darkness. I'd say they're just in it, and there's almost like no hope. And I think the idea of being trapped is an excellent way of looking at it, especially when you think about some of the best ones. I think, like, some of the most affecting ones are when they're kind of trapped by themselves, when the hope is lost because they fail to act, or they fail to change. That's some of the nastiest. And I think that you can probably look at the difference. I think in dark fantasy, it's more a case of they are able to overcome it. They're able to overcome the darkness and get out of the darkness. And I think going back to Alan's point about the horror as well, I think that fits in as well with the idea that with horror, what we're really looking at is that sense of doom is when they become really alone, when they're really kind of lost in that. Then we really narrow it down into the horror aspect. So, it's a good way of looking at it.
Carol, we'll go to you.
Yeah, I think all of those are great thoughts. What came to me was the feeling of being trapped or helplessness. I think is something that is very relatable, because I think, as most of us are not people who have agency to change the world, we often do have all experienced moments of feeling trapped, of feeling helpless, of feeling not unhappy with a situation or something that has happened, whether that be, like Phil was saying, something of our own making or something not of our own making. And just the feeling of the inability to get out of it in any way has got to be one of the worst feelings. The frustration and even depression and anxiety of not being able to have the agency to change a situation, which is weighing on you in whatever way. And I do think that's interesting, talking about Grimdark, exploring that, and perhaps there is no way out, right? Whereas maybe dark fantasy explore it, but then somehow they are able to overcome it. I don't know if that means, like, not dark fantasy is they don't explore it, because I don't know if that's necessarily true either. I'm not really sure there, because, but I do like that talk of being trapped in the agency. I think that's a really good question, a good thought, and what makes that distinction. So,
Alan, we'll finish with you on this topic.
Well, thank you. I want to follow up on something Phil said. I think that a distinct difference between horror and grimdark is, and military grimdark in particular, and I think 2/3 of my series would qualify as military grimdark, is that in grimdark, you're part of a band. You're part of a unit, a squad, a platoon, a something. You're not alone. We unhappy few, we band of brothers. I mean, even in the US, the Marines have this motto, the few, the proud, the Marines. So you're facing this horrible fate. And it's probably a no-win scenario, but at least you're not alone. Whereas in real pure horror, I think you're facing it the way we face death. But you're right. I think there is an impotence, a lack of power on behalf of the common man or the people in the military unit. And that's why you root for them. They're the underdog, even if there are 100 of them or 1,000 of them or 10,000 of them against the greater power. I think the lack of agency is what makes dramatic suspense there and makes it a compelling story. If they had agency, who would care? You know, we have the power to do whatever we want. Okay, well, that's a really short story.
Fiddles T. Brigand will neither confirm nor deny if they're typing with pause, which I would love to see. I'm not going to lie about it. I would love to see how this works. Please send me screenshots of the cat typing. I'd love to see it. Okay, so we're coming towards the end of our hour. It's gone very, very quickly. So before we wrap up, I've got one. It's a quote that I'm gonna give to you all, and we can discuss it for the last 6 or 7 minutes, and then we'll wrap up and we tell everyone where we can find each other on the internet, in our rooms, in our houses, miles away from each other. So in 2016, Damien Walters of The Guardian, a UK newspaper, said Grimdark was a commercial imperative to win adolescent male readers and is in opposition to truly epic and more emotionally nuanced kind of fantasy. Anna, we'll start with you because I see you laughing already.
Well, he could just fuck off. Particularly if The Guardian refuses to review my books. The Daily Mail loves me, but The Guardian will not. Because no, I mean that is based on that kind of, you know, what happened with the later series of Game of Thrones, where it did just become, hey, how can we throw another pair of tits into this? Hey, how can we liven this up? Hey, let's have old Ramsay rape someone else. You know, it just, Grimdark is totally misunderstood. There is this, I remember when I was first kind of doing the convention circuit, so I say to people, oh yeah, I write Grimdark, and they look at me like, you're a woman who writes Grimdark? I mean, that's just like rapey stuff, isn't it? It's like, no. You know, it's just total horrible misunderstanding of everything the Grimdark which is about, yes, I mean, I don't write rape scenes, but I make it very, very clear in what I'm writing that, you know, this is total war. What do you think happens in total war to the female civilians? You know, I'm writing a very gendered world in which men are given the free ability to do whatever the hell they like. What do you think they're going to do? And that point is making that point, is pointing out people's dark impulses, it's pointing out how actually really bestial we all are, and how very easy it is for it would be for any of us to do those things. And pointing out that maybe that's a bad thing. It's not. People sort of talk about, you know, epic fantasy is, there is this guy and he is great and he's going to kill all these bad guys, and they are just, you know, they're just faceless evil things, and then everything will be wonderful, which is an absolute fucking terrifying narrative. It's kind of, you know, it's actually, I sort of make this really, really bad taste joke about how two really important books of fantasy came out of the First World War, one of which is the book about a misunderstood, you know, his own people have turned his back on him, but he will come to power and he will save the world, and he will drive all those disgusting, bestial, dark things which are destroying the world. He will get rid of them all and just wipe them all away and make the world better. The other one is The Lord of the Rings. Boom, boom. Grimdark is saying that. That's what Grimdark is about. It's pointing out to people that that's what the heroic narrative is. And I'm undermining it and really pointing out, you know, when you believe in that chap standing up saying, I will make America great again, well, these are the consequences. People look at the really superficial, oh, well, it has someone being raped in it, oh, that must be bad, and only see that. And that makes me so angry. Sorry, I shall stop ranting and let someone else talk.
I would, Anna, if you ever meet Damien Walters, please record what the conversation is like. I would love to see it. It'd be fantastic entertainment. Phil, we'll go with you on this
yeah,
quote.
well, I don't have a great deal to add to that. I think to be honest, it's the thing that gets me with that quote is the fact that he's talking about how it lacks nuance, which I find completely ridiculous, because Grimdark is so concerned with morally ambiguous characters that the best Grimdark is some of the most nuanced work that you can find, I think, in fantasy. It's epic. Your standard epic fantasy is so much simpler. It's a really strange stance to take, I would say.
Mhm. Yeah. Carol, any thoughts from yourself on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think Anna and Phil both said it well, but I mean, I think that's ridiculous. And I don't even really read a lot of Grimdark. But I think sometimes these fantasy can be nuanced or it cannot be. And I don't know that grimdark or not grimdark, they're different kinds. Even epic fantasy that's not necessarily grimdark can have nuance and depth and philosophical character, whatever it is he's looking for. And so can grimdark. And I think it's ridiculous to just write off an entire subgenre, saying, well, that doesn't have any nuance, because clearly it's just about all the killing and murder and raping and all that kind of thing. And that's just absolutely ridiculous. Obviously, he hasn't read any good ones, so
Yeah, I would love to know what he was talking about and what his previous like history of reading fantasy was. Like he may have read like Narnia or something and was like, "This is what it is all about," and then he's read. Alan, we'll close with you on your thoughts on this one, please.
Well, I'm going to continue the pounding. I think that's just a shallow comment. If he'd read R. Scott Baker and read The Prince of Nothing, Drusus Acamian is not a character for an adolescent boy. He's a middle-aged man, who's struggling against his aging process and perhaps his approaching senility, and he's got to deal with someone who's much younger and more powerful and more vital than he is. And I think the same is true to some extent of the captain in the Black Company novels. And Erickson is replete with a lot of characters that you can only understand when you've lived a certain number of years. You can only understand their perspectives when you've had to make these horrible choices between feeding the kids or paying the rent, or when you've experienced a certain amount of loss in your life, to really understand what it is. And I think that George R. R. Martin has those characters too. So I just feel like he hasn't done any reading, not just Grimdark, but any reading whatsoever. I mean, who writes a book nowadays without some sort of middle-aged perspective in it, without some sort of characters who address the vast majority of us are living and experiencing every day?
Mm-hmm. That's correct. I mean, I would always. I mean, I know Glenn Cook is and Erickson and George Martin are people we talked about, but something I always kind of consider myself as maybe a prelude to Grimdark was Thomas Covenant.
Yes.
And I don't think you can get much more nuanced than the character of Thomas Covenant as well, which is does terrible things and he does good things and he just does things, which we all do. They're neither good nor bad. To my panel and to everyone who's watching on the chat, thank you very much. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I certainly have. Anna, where can people find you on the internet?
Oh, so I tweet as Queen of Grimdark. I'm on Facebook as Anna Smith Spark. I have an Anna Smith Spark author page as well. I'm not really on Twitter or Facebook at the moment at all, because this year has not been easy for me. So, I mean, I know it's not been easy for anyone, but one of the ways I dealt with that was by coming off social media a lot. So I'm trying to get on social media a bit more, and I've been homeschooling 2 children as well. So, yeah, it's not been a particularly fantasy one for me. And I'm supposed to have a website, but I blew it up, so I need to restore it. So yeah, this year has not been going terribly well so far.
Well, hopefully the rest of the year is going to be much better.
It can only get better.
So, unlike Grimdark, it can only get better. Carol, yourself, where can people find you at home? Not at your home. I mean, like people.
Yeah, no, I can tell that. But I tweet Park Carol A. It looks like Park Corolla, and I do have a website, carolepark.com. And a Facebook. I don't really use Facebook a lot. I'm much more active on Twitter. That's the best way if you really want to follow me and engage with me. So, yeah. those would be the things.
Phil?
So,
Phil, yeah.
My website's phil-williams.co.uk. That's the first place to find me, but I'm most active on Twitter for social media, where I'm at Fantastic Phil, because I'm very modest.
Yes. And Alan, yourself.
I have a website, immortaltreachery.com, but I'm on Twitter at tvikers. I'm really on every social media platform that you can think of. You just have to poke around and find me when I'm not pretending to be Dirk Ashton. Throw that in there.
Dirk Ashton is Michael R. Fletcher. So are you? In which case, hi.
How many people are you?
You have to ask my wife.
And I'm on everything as well, but like Twitter would probably be the quickest way. You can find all my stuff on Twitter. It's at David Green Write, like as in writing, not that I'm correct, because I very often am not. And that has been the panel on Grimdark, Dark Fantasy and Horror. So thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the panelists for giving us your time and opinions and thoughts. It's been very entertaining. And enjoy the rest of QuaranCon.
Bye.
Bye.